All right, well, hello and welcome to a really wonderful debate that we have organized between two fantastic philosophers. So the motion that we will be discussing is, does God exist? In one corner, we have Richard Swinburne. He's an emeritus professor at Oxford University, and he has written some of the most prominent books in this field, The Coherence of Theism, and all of you should go to a fine bookstore anywhere and purchase one of his books, in my opinion. And then in the atheistic corner, we have Stephen Kershnar. He's written books such as Does a Pro-Life Worldview Make Sense? He is an expert in ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of religion. And it's going to be fantastic discussion. The format of the debate is we will have openings, rebuttals, there will be an audience question period where you guys will get to be involved, and we will proceed in that fashion. So to start out, we'll have Richard with his opening. So Richard, yes, if you'd like to start, you can. I'll note before we begin. So I'm going to hold this up if you can see me when you have a minute left, and if you have seconds left, I'll hold this up just to indicate time without being intrusive. So yeah.
I'll take you through the handout. I believe that there's a God because I believe the existence of God is made probable by the most general observable features of the universe, which on my handout I mark by E below. And I think E makes H above that probable. It makes it probable that God provides a causal explanation of the existence of the universe with these characteristics. I believe that the criteria for a causal explanation being probably true are the ones which I state on my handout. They concern both purported explanations of the personal kind and ones of the inanimate or scientific kind. By a personal explanation, I mean one that explains the occurrence by the action of some person who brings it about in order to achieve some purpose which he believes would be achieved by bringing that about. On the other hand, a scientific explanation purports to explain some event in terms of an initial condition and the operation of it on it of laws of nature. That's very odd that there should be two very different kinds of causal explanation. And I think the answer to that is that the scientific type explanation can really be put in a more satisfactory way. To say that there is a law of nature, for example, take a trivial example, that all iron expands when heated, is just to say that every bit of iron has the power to expand and the liability to exercise that power under the circumstances that it is heated. So, given that, the two kinds of explanation are both very similar. In both cases, it is a substance, a thing, a bit of iron or a person, which is producing the effect, and the persons produce it. Both of these produce it in virtue of their powers, but persons produce it in virtue of also having a purpose and a belief that that will be fulfilled by bringing about this particular event, whereas in the inanimate case, it's brought about by substances exercising their powers and having liabilities to exercise them under certain circumstances. But for both kinds, I suggest the observed evidence, whatever it is, makes a hypothesis purporting to provide a causal explanation of it probable insofar as these four conditions which I've listed on the handout apply. It has to be probable in order for E to make H probable. It has to be probable that E will happen given H, and it has to be not probable that E will happen given not H. H has to be a simple hypothesis, And if it's a narrow type hypothesis, e.g. about the structure of some particular chemical element, it has to fit in with a wider knowledge of how the world works. But if it's a very large-scale hypothesis, such as quantum theory, there's really nothing else that it has to fit into. It rather purports to explain everything else. And so theism is not obliged to satisfy any fourth condition. Okay, now, for example, and I'll just take a trivial detective example, which I use very often. Suppose there has been a burglary. Some money has been stolen from a safe. The detective investigating this has three clues. First, that a known person, John, was seen near the crime, or reported being seen near the scene of the crime at the time when it was committed. Secondly, John's fingerprints were found on the safe. Thirdly, money equivalent in amount to the amount stolen was found in John's house. The detective reasonably argues that shows that John makes it very probable that John robbed the safe. But when it comes to trial, the defending lawyer says these purported bits of evidence can easily be explained in other ways. We only have reports of John being seen. John does actually have a twin brother who looks very like him, and maybe it was the twin brother who was seen. The prints are on safe, but some quite other person, Charles, knows how to put prints on metal surfaces, and he captured John's fingerprints from some other surface and put them on there. The other clue that the money was found in the house, well, it was the proceeds of another burglary by a third person, who we will call William, and William thought that John's house would be a good place to put the money. Now, of course, the jury will not accept that explanation and will find John guilty. And the reason is that the second explanation is not a simple explanation. It postulates a number of different people coincidentally producing a certain result, and not for coordinated reasons, whereas the detective's hypothesis postulates one person doing everything that produces the evidence. And that applies to scientific explanations as well. For any collection of data, you can have an infinite number of purported explanations which satisfy both the first two criteria. You can see that very obviously in the curve fitting example. If you imagine an x-axis up vertically and a y-axis horizontally, and you're trying to find the values, the equation governing the relation of x and y, and you mark on the graph the values of y for certain values of x, and however many you mark on, an infinite number of curves will pass through them. But if there's a straight line that passes through them, then the equation is obvious, x equals y. And likewise, if some other rather simple curve passes through them. But the mere fact that some complicated curve will have this result is not evidence that the hypothesis is true, probably true. Right, turning that one now to our example, theism. The hypothesis, which I'm going to spell out now, there is a God, and I'm going to understand that as there is an essentially eternally omnipotent being. and that means a being to whose power, omnipotence, and length of life, everlastingness, there are zero limits. Zero is a very simple number. And the hypothesis postulates that there is only one entity with one power, which he has to unlimited degree and unlimited life. So it's a very simple hypothesis, but a lot follows from it. If the being is to be omnipotent, he must know what are the alternatives available to him in order to choose what to do. And therefore, he has to be omniscient in the sense of knowing everything logically possible for such a being to know. And that means knowing everything except what he has not yet chosen to do, or what he has allowed any other free agent to do. Now, among the things that an omniscient being, omniscient in this sense, will know is that some actions are good and some actions are bad. And recognizing that an action is good makes an agent have some inclination to do it. This is moral internalism, and examples bear that out. So, from his mere nature, he will be perfectly good because he will just see that things are good and do them for that reason. Of course, we, human beings, have bad desires as well, and so we have to choose between them. But to add to God the hypothesis that he has bad desires would make it a much more complicated hypothesis, and so, for that reason, unlikely to be true. That is the hypothesis of theism. Given that hypothesis, I think it very probable that God would create a universe of the type described, for the very simple reason that we are good things. Humans are good things. Humans are marvelous things. And in particular, they have a kind of freedom that God does not have to choose between good and evil. And therefore, since God wants to give us great gifts, that will be a great gift that he would very naturally want to give us. It is a great gift that we can be, as it were, mini creators, making a difference to the world, making a difference to ourselves. That's a great gift. And by making differences to the world and ourselves and other people, we gradually form our characters, because each time we do a good action of a certain kind, it makes it easier to do a good action of the next kind, and conversely. And so we are given limited powers to make great differences, and that's a great gift of a kind, since it includes a kind of goodness that God does not have, and since the other features we have are good features exemplified to a higher degree, mainly in God, it's very likely he would wish to bring about such beings. So I suggest that criterion 1 is satisfied. Criterion 3, I hope it is fairly obvious that it is satisfied, and that I've already given the reasons for that. One being, one power, zero limits to it. As for criterion 2, if there were no God, it is immensely improbable that any of these things would occur. Why should there be a large physical universe? But if there is one with lots of bits in it, why should each bit be governed by the same simple laws? That is to say, have the same propensities, same powers and liabilities to act. Every atom in the universe attracts every other atom with exactly the same power. That is an enormous coincidence, unless something has brought it about. And the simplest explanation of simply something that could bring it about, is of course a God. Likewise, even if there are simple laws of nature, which we need in order to know the effects of our actions, we need to know, for example, that if we light a fire, we can either use it to burn our enemies' crops or to cook our food, and it's because of these regularities in nature that we can make a difference to the world. And the regularities are only going to exist if there are simple laws. But the simple laws must be such as to produce us. And there are 4 kinds, or possibly 4, 5, or even maybe 6 kinds of laws which operate in the universe. Gravity, strong force, weak force, electromagnetism in particular. And if any one of these didn't operate, then we wouldn't exist. And if any one of these had a constant in any very small way different from the constant it has, again, we wouldn't exist. And this is, of course, the fine-tuning of each constant. It has to lie within a very, very narrow, very 10 to the 40th narrow, in some cases, of the possible values being estimated as the ones which the values in the different forces. If you suppose that the strongest force is the strong force and the weakest force is gravity, then the constants differ in those by 10 to the 40th, and each constant has to lie within a very, very tiny area in order for this effect. And even if all that was satisfied, there's not the slightest reason to suppose that humans would be conscious beings, because all the laws we're dealing with are laws which concern only physical effects. And therefore, criterion 2 is extremely well satisfied. And for those reasons, I suggest to you that the evidence I have described makes it very probable that there is a God. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Joe, for getting in with a share screen. And thank you, Richard, for an incredible opening statement. It was very informative, and if I dare say so, very persuasive as well. So, Steve, if you want to go ahead and begin your opening statement, I know that you have a PowerPoint, so if you want to share your screen. So, Steve, why don't you go ahead and start? Your time begins now.
Great. All right. So I'm going to argue for atheism. Just a brief legal point. My work reflects, it's my own work, doesn't reflect any group or employer with which I'm associated. And I'd really like to thank Nathan, Richard, Joe, and Perry. It's just a pleasure and an honor to get a chance to present with you guys. Richard had a huge influence on my philosophical development when I sat in his lecture series in 1987, and also his written work. So it's just, a tremendous honor to be able to present alongside him. All right. I'm going to argue for 3 theses. First, I'm going to argue that if the ontological argument and the fine-tuning argument are sound or strong evidence, then the modal ontological argument is sound. And you can see the structure above. So I claim that the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument depend on the modal ontological argument. That is, the theist lives and dies on the modal ontological argument. Second, I'm going to argue that the modal ontological argument is unsound. And then given to these 2 results, I'm going to argue that God probably does not exist. So 3 theses that I'm going to try and support. First, if the cosmological argument, the first thesis, the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument are sound or strong evidence, then the modal ontological argument is sound. Okay, so let's consider a sort of a minimalist version of the cosmological argument. Okay, and this relies on the principle of sufficient reason. Principle of sufficient reason says that there's an explanation for every fact. And by an explanation, I mean a cause or a reason. Okay, so here's the version that I'm going to use. And as you know, there are several different versions. Premise 1, there is an explanation for every fact. Premise 2, if premise 1 is true, then there a self-existent being exists. That's because either there's a beginning in time, in which case the first being, which got the chain going, was going to have to be self-existent, or there's an infinite chain of beings, in which case we need something to explain why there's something as opposed to nothing. And that thing has to be self-explanatory, because otherwise we'd have another infinite regress. So if premise one is true, then a self-existent being exists. Hence, a self-existing being exists. I think God is the most likely suspect for the self-existent being. Hence, God exists. Okay. Why do I think this supports the modal ontological argument? Well, premise one says the cosmological argument depends on God's nature explaining his existence. That is God's self-explanatory. Something about God explains why he exists. What could that be? Well, God couldn't cause himself to come into existence, because you first have to exist before you can cause anything. So it seems that God would have to explain his own existence. Well, what about God would explain his own existence? It's his nature. And I claim specifically his perfection. So if his perfection explains his existence, that is the modal ontological argument. So we have premise two. If premise one is correct, and the modal ontological argument justifies the cosmological argument. Conclusion one, hence the modal ontological argument justifies the cosmological argument. Right. To block this, you'd have to show that God is a self-explanatory being, but somehow God's perfection is not that which explains why he exists. Okay, consider the fine-tuning argument. Okay. One explanation of a fact is better than others, then probably is true. Again, real minimalist version of the fine-tuning argument. Second, the intelligent designer explanation of the existence of intelligent life is better than others. Conclusion, hence, probably the intelligent designer explanation of the existence of intelligent life is true. And the idea is that, look, if we have the best result that could happen, and it's extraordinarily unlikely that could happen without intelligent design, that's good evidence that we have an intelligent designer. Premise three, if conclusion one is true, that is the intelligent designer explanation of the existence of intelligent life is true, then probably God is the intelligent designer of the universe. Who else would have enough power, knowledge, and motivation to create the universe? Hence, probably God is the intelligent designer of the universe. Okay, so that's my minimalist version of the fine-tuning argument. Okay, so here the idea is that that if the fine-tuning argument is sound, then God alone designed the universe. Premise one. Premise two, if God alone designed the universe, then no one designed God. If someone designed God, then God would not have alone have designed the universe. Whoever designed God would have also designed the universe. And there will also be a concern about an infinite regress of designers. Premise three, if no one designed God, then the modal ontological argument is sound. Why would someone think this is true? Well, if no one designed God, then we'd have to have a non-designer explanation of existence. That is, something would explain why we have an undesigned designer. And if God has a non-designer explanation of his existence, then his nature must explain his existence. What else could do? Again, he couldn't cause himself to come to existence. And assumption 3C, if God's nature explains his existence, then presumably it's his perfection that does so, and his perfection does so, then the modal ontological argument is sound. That is, it just is the modal ontological argument. Conclusion, hence, if the fine-tuning argument is sound, then the modal ontological argument is sound. Okay, so I claim then that the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments depend on the modal ontological argument. We need this because we need to explain why God is a self-explanatory being, and also to explain how we get an undesigned designer. Okay, my second argument is that the modal ontological argument, my second thesis is that the modal ontological argument is unsound. Okay, now this is going to be a real minimalist version. I mean, technically we'd have to state it a little different, but I wanted sort of a clean, readable version. So first, we begin with the notion that God is perfect, right? And that's just a quick way of saying that God is the maximally great being. Okay? And I claim that this is an essential feature of God. Premise one, if God is maximally great or perfect, then he necessarily exists. Why would someone think this? Well, if God is perfect, then he has every great-making feature to a maximum degree. And assumption 2b, if God has every great-making feature, then his greatness does not depend on other things. For example, other beings or random events. That is, independence is a great-making property. Assumption 2C, necessary existence. If God's greatness does not depend on other beings, then he necessarily exists. And if God necessarily exists, then he exists. So premise 2, if premise 1 is true, then God necessarily exists. Hence, conclusion 1, hence God necessarily exists. And if he necessarily exists, then he actually exists. Okay, so that is the modal ontological argument. Again, we'd have to tighten it up if we wanted a more technically presentable view, right? It's possible that a maximally greatest being exists, but I did this for readability. Okay, well, what do we mean by greatness? So here it's important when we say that a maximally great being or a perfect being, we have to be clear in terms of what we mean by greatness. Now, we could mean just greatness simplicator, except for that I don't know what greatness simplicator is. Greatness seems to enhance some other term. You can have a great Chinese soup or a great hockey player. But greatness itself does not seem to be a property. Rather, it seems to enhance other properties. Right? For example, what would have in common a greater number and a greater soup, for example? Well, if greatness has to do with some sort of value, greatness itself is not a property, it's a greater value or greatest value. What could we mean by value? We could mean either a moral value or a non-moral value. But it's not clear that a non-moral value is the sort of thing that will justify the modal ontological argument, right? It's not clear why something is better were it to have a non-moral property than were it not to have such a property. For example, consider the property of intrinsic sexual value. It's not clear that something is better in virtue of having that than in virtue of not having that. Well, if it's a moral value, then it's going to be either an intrinsic value or total value. Total value is going to include both intrinsic and extrinsic value. But I don't think it's total value. Why not? Again, we can have great individuals who have negative extrinsic value. Consider if Marcus Aurelius had negative extrinsic value, because if his parents didn't have him, they would have had someone much, much greater. Still, it's not clear that this prevents him from having the sort of greatness with which we're concerned with in the modal ontological argument. Instead, what we seem to have in mind is intrinsic moral value. This seems to be intuitively what we're getting at. It also seems to make sense of how the argument works. That is, an individual is greater if he necessarily exists in virtue of having greater intrinsic moral value than if he just contingently existed. Or in the old version, he was greater existing than not existing in virtue of having greater intrinsic moral value. Now, for those people who don't like this account of greatness, I would ask them, well, what sort of greatness do you have in mind, if not intrinsic moral value? Okay. Well, this leads us to our first argument then against the modal ontological argument being sound. And this has to do with intrinsic value. And the idea is that premise 1, a being who is contingently perfect or contingently maximally great is as great a being as one who is necessarily perfect. Okay? My claim is that greatness depends on and only on a being's intrinsic moral goodness. And a contingent perfect being has as much intrinsic goodness as a necessary perfect being. That is, what do you get? Does it diminish someone's value if they're somehow imperfect or flawed in some distant possible world? I don't think that it does. So if assumptions 1A and 1B are true, then a being who is contingently perfect is as great as a being who is necessarily perfect. Premise 2. If premise 1 is correct, then the modal ontological argument is unsound, and I claim, therefore, the modal ontological argument is unsound. Let me be a little more explicit. The idea is that if necessary perfection is not better than contingent perfection, then it seems also that necessary existence is not better than contingent existence. And since I do think necessary perfection is not better than contingent perfection, I also think that necessary existence is not better than contingent existence. Okay, just 2 quick examples. Consider an exam score. Alice scores 100 on an exam, but flunks it in a distant possible world. Alice does as well in the exam as someone, Betty, who gets 100 on it in every possible world. Modal performance does not and should not affect one's exam score. Okay, that's just to get at the idea. Here's a better example, the idea of wife. So in the actual world, Carol is morally perfect, at least given the limits of human perfection. She is also perfect for her husband. The fact that in some distant possible world she is a bad person and also bad for her husband does not diminish her intrinsic and extrinsic value in the actual world. Intuitively, modal evil does not make Carol have any less intrinsic moral value. It does not even make her have less extrinsic moral value. Okay, so that's my first argument then, that greatness is a matter of intrinsic moral value, and contingent intrinsic moral value is as valuable as necessary intrinsic moral value. Second argument, significant moral responsibility. I claim that if a being is perfect, then he is morally responsible for a significant act. By significant act, I mean an act that involves the choice between good and evil. Now, premise one is true. So why do I think this? Well, if a being is perfect, then he's morally responsible for a significant act. That is what makes something maximally great, is that he has the greatest responsibility. And the greatest responsibility doesn't have constrained or hemmed in responsibility. It's unlimited responsibility. And unlimited responsibility involves the choice between good and evil. Now, libertarian responsibility, if a person is morally responsible, then he has libertarian free will. Okay, I'm just going to assume this because this is widely assumed in theistic contexts. And I want to claim that if a person has libertarian free will with regard to significant act, then in some possible world he has an evil thought. And let me jump ahead to why we would think this. If a person can do an evil action, right? So if you have significant moral responsibility, it has to be open to you to choose between good and evil. So if you have that significant moral responsibility, then you can do evil. And I claim if you can do evil, then you can decide to do evil. If you can decide to do evil, I claim it follows that you can be motivated to do evil. There's no way someone can decide, it's possible for them to decide to do evil. They can't be motivated to do evil. And if you can be motivated to do evil, then you can have an evil attitude. It might be a belief, desire, or an intention. So it follows from this that in some possible world, a person has an evil attitude, right? And in some possible world, if a person has an evil attitude, then a maximally free being, a being with significant moral responsibility, is going to be contingently omnibenevolent. So going back to this argument, if a being is perfect, then he's morally responsible for a significant act. And premise one, if one is true, then the modal ontological argument is unsound. Hence, the modal ontological argument is unsound. And again, the idea is that necessary perfection is not better than contingent perfection. In fact, contingent perfection is better than necessary perfection precisely because it allows for significant responsibility. And if necessary perfection is not better than contingent perfection, there's no reason to think that necessary existence is better than contingent existence. And hence, we should conclude that necessary existence is not better than contingent existence. Okay, and the idea is that, the basic idea is that, look, if freedom is a basic intrinsic value maker, that is, freedom makes someone more valuable than the lack of freedom would be, the same thing seems to be true with significant responsibility. This, in fact, aligns with the notion that God creates human beings so that they have significant responsibility because he values the fact that they choose to avoid it and also that they can improve themselves. If that were true for human beings, it would seem to also be true for God. All right, we get to the third conclusion then, and that is that God probably does not exist. Okay, so the context here is that I claim the cosmological fine-tuning and modal ontological argument all fail. So the argument is premise one, if one theory explains the data at least as well as the second theory, and the first is simpler than the second, and the first is more likely to be true. Okay, I claim that atheism explains the data at least as well as theism. This depends on the notion that the cosmological fine-tuning and modal ontological argument fail. Once you think those arguments fail, theism has very little explanatory power. Might have some with regard to religious experience, but still very little. And atheism is simpler than theism. Why would we think that? Well, think of three types of simplicity. The number of types of things a theory posits, the number of things a theory posits, and the complexity per thing. Theism includes all the materialism types of things and at least one additional thing, God, perhaps other angels as well. Second, theism includes all the material things and again, at least one additional thing, namely God. So it has more types and more things. Those are two measures of complexity. Third, complexity per thing. Theism has extraordinary complexity per thing. One idea is computational complexity, which I'm taking from Peter Millikan. If you imagine the power required, the computational power to understand every particle in the universe under every possible scenario, the computational complexity is immense. This is extremely complex. Consider also a thing that has infinite powers. The sort of machinery underlying a thing that has infinite powers has incredible complexity. And third, if you posit actual infinity with its problems with seeming contradictions, this seems to be a extremely complex theory. Now, let me just say one other thing about simplicity here, and that is, if you have a theory of simplicity with regard to God, you cannot have more than one O. That's because the O's contradict each other. Also, if you have perfect freedom, then you can't have any of the O's. So when it comes to complexity, there are sharp limits in the sort of being that you can posit. Let me just quickly show you the contradictions. If a being has significant responsibility, then he has evil thoughts in some possible world. Consider a being that's either significantly responsible or has essentially omnibenevolence. We can ask, can he have evil thoughts in a possible world? If yes, then he's not essentially benevolent. If no, this opens the door for significant responsibility. He can't have both. Consider essential omnibenevolence and essential omnipotence, and consider whether God has the power to do evil. If he has it, then he's not essentially omnibenevolent. If he doesn't, then he's not essentially omnipotent. Consider essential omnibenevolence and essential omniscience. Can God know the joys of doing evil? If he can, then he's not going to be essentially omnibenevolent. And if he can't, then this opens the door for essentially omniscience. There's also a potential conflict between essential omnipotence and essential omniscience with regard to whether God can have de se knowledge of what it's like to be weak or vulnerable. Okay, so in short, I've claimed that the theist lives and dies in the modal ontological argument. That's because the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument depend on it. I've claimed the modal ontological argument was unsound, and I've claimed that based on these two things and also the comparative simplicity, that therefore God probably does not exist. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for a really engaging opening statement. That was certainly a lot. It was like drinking from a fire hose, so I'm sure that will provide plenty of fodder for discussion and debate. So with that, Richard, if you want to begin your rebuttal, then you're more than welcome to do so.
Thank you. I've noted 4 or 5 main points where I disagree with you. The first is that you suppose that God is a metaphysically necessary being, and that that's sort of intrinsic to our understanding of God. The notion of a being whose non-existence entails some sort of incompatibility only arrived on the philosophical scene with Avicenna in the 9th century, and only arrived in the Christian conception of God with Anselm. So for the first Christian millennium, this notion of God as a necessary being in that sense is simply not what they were discussing. It wasn't assumed. Even Aquinas, when he talks about God, a necessary being, he tends to use it in a number of different senses. But in one of the senses he uses, a necessary being is simply something that doesn't decay under its own steam. We decay, we die, so do plants. But according to Aquinas, souls don't decay, and nor do angels, so they're necessary beings. And Aquinas says that what distinguishes God from other necessary beings is that they're unconditioned necessary beings. That is to say, nothing is the cause of God's being, a being that doesn't decay. So even he is not using a necessary being in this context as the sort of thing you were supposing. And I'm glad that is the case, because I don't think it's logically possible for there to be a necessary being in that sense. You, in your brief accounts of ontological arguments, that always has to appear that the being, a necessary being, is a logical, or perhaps more widely, if it is more widely, necessary being. And I think there's absolutely no reason to suppose there can be such a necessary being. And I ask you to give a reason. But I can give you some sort of a reason why it's most unlikely, and that is to say, if God is a necessary being, then the proposition necessarily an omnipotent being, or whatever description you want to give of God, exists. But if that is the case, then it is not logically possible that there is no omniscient being, omnipotent being. But it is a feature, that's a negative existential claim, but it is an interesting feature of negative existential claims that they never do entail contradictions, apart from this alleged counterexample. You know, there are no apples is perfect, doesn't entail a contradiction, nor does there are no apples nor oranges entail a contradiction. And anything you like to add to those, they don't entail a contradiction. And indeed, they don't entail a positive existential claim either. So if you're going to say this one is the exception, you've got to make some sort of justification of it, and I've never seen one. So I don't go along with that assumption, and I've no sympathy with ontological arguments. I don't think between us we need to spend much time on them. Note they are very different from all the other arguments around for the existence of God, including, of course, the one that I gave. That is to say, a typical argument argues from some observable feature of God to something that explains it, and arguing from observable features to explanatory causes is something we're doing all the time. But an ontological argument isn't like that. It argues from certain general metaphysical principles to there being a God. And although its exponents wouldn't like to admit this, what it's doing is it's explaining the existence of God by these principles which are forcing God to exist. And that's cutting God rather down to size more than a typical theist would wish. Now, another thing that you were raising, the principle of sufficient reason. I don't see any reason to believe the principle of sufficient reason. And indeed, there is the objection that if there's a reason for A and it's B, and so either there's no reason for B, or there's C, or you go back infinitely far, and then there's no reason why there's a chain of explanatory reasons. And sort of obvious modern counterexamples would be very acceptable versions of quantum theory allow that particles just move one way or the other, or just decay at a certain time or other without there being a reason why they do so. So I don't see any reason for endorsing that principle either. Now, I think these, as it were, are two of the main troubles with your arguments. We come on to a third main trouble, and that is your point that a perfect being must be able to choose between good and evil, have libertarian free will. But if he does have libertarian free will, it can only be a contingent truth that he always chooses the good. And I think you might have said that's pretty unlikely if it's only a contingent truth. But suppose it is a truth, it will only be a truth by accident, because in some possible world, clearly he does do evil. And therefore, you say that God would need libertarian free will in order to be a perfect being. And if he doesn't have it, he wouldn't be. You are starting with a notion of perfection, which I certainly don't start with. I start with arguing that there is an omnipotent being, and deduce what follows from that. And I don't have intuitions about perfection or its absence. But you must allow the possibility that there are, indeed, it's pretty obvious when you think about it, incompatible good states. And take a trivial example, which was Bernard Williams's example. It's a great good for someone to be monogamously married to Mary, and it's a great good for someone to be monogamously married to Elizabeth. But these great goods can't be had at the same time. And similarly, the great goods of libertarian freedom and the great goods of being essentially good can't coexist. And so it's not logically possible that someone could have them both. And you are arguing that somehow God would have to have them both in order to be perfect. But a perfect being, surely, if one could spell that notion out, is a being who has the maximum logically possible degree of perfection. And that's going to include just one or the other. And that's how it is. And that God can do no evil is therefore not inferior to him having free will, nor is it greater. But that is why God would wish to give to us libertarian free will, although he doesn't have it himself. And it's common view God can do no evil. I think, I should say something about your views on simplicity. You argue that atheism explains things. Well, atheism couldn't explain anything. It's just the denial of theism. I think what you have in mind is naturalism. And naturalism, I take it, is the view that the world is just there and doesn't need an explanation. But that is to postulate, as it were, a very large number of things. All the atoms, all the bits out of which the atoms are made as the starting points, as it were. But the criterion of simplicity is not a criterion for assessing both the explanans and the explanandum. It's a criterion for assessing the explanans. If you can explain many things by few, that is a simpler explanation. And indeed, the more many things you can explain by the fewer things, the better. And the fact that the naturalist admits the existence of all these bits it doesn't make his hypothesis any less simple, so long as his explanans, God, can explain why all these bits are. So it's irrelevant that there are all these things that God explains, the more he explains, the better. The simplicity of a theory is the simplicity of its fit.
Yeah, so Steve, if you're ready to do your rebuttal, then you are free to go ahead and do so.
Great. Well, as always, I'd like to thank Richard for his excellent comments. Superb, interesting, really thought-provoking, quite powerful. Okay, so if I understand, Richard had 4 objections. Number 1, that that the theist does not need the modal ontological argument, and in addition, that the modal ontological argument is unsound because it presupposes the idea of a necessary existent being. Second, that he doesn't need the principle of sufficient reason. Third, that the maximally greatest being does not have to have significant free will. Instead, we can start with omniscience. And then fourth, that atheism is not, in fact, naturalistic atheism, materialistic atheism, is not, in fact, simpler than theism. So let me address each one of these 4. Let's begin with the notion that the modal ontological argument is unsound and the theist doesn't depend on it. I don't see how the cosmological argument and fine-tuning arguments don't depend on it. Take the cosmological argument. If you say that God is a self-explanatory being, and therefore that something about God explains his existence, in particular his necessary existence, we say, well, what could it be? It's not like God can cause himself to exist. Well, what would allow God to explain his own existence? Well, presumably it'd be something like his being the maximally greatest being, or his perfection. But that just is the modal ontological argument. So I fail to see how you can say that God is a self-existent being without committing yourself to the modal ontological argument. Now, perhaps someone doesn't want to, their version of the cosmological argument doesn't rely on a self-explanatory being, but then it's unclear what makes it go. And then this brings up the next issue, which is that Professor Swinburne said, look, I don't accept principle of sufficient reason. Principle of sufficient reason says that every fact has an explanation, or an explanation is either a cause or a reason for something. But if not every fact has an explanation, it would seem they're brute facts, right? Facts which do not have an explanation. And in one of Professor Swinburne's superb books, he says God's existence is a brute fact. But the problem is, if God's existence is a brute fact, why can't the universe be a brute fact? That is, what makes God a better brute fact than the universe? In addition, you might think once you let in one brute fact, why aren't there others? That is, what's to stop brute fact promiscuity? But third, the theistic model is much more powerful. Rather than saying that God's existence is a brute fact, if we say no, rather something explains God's existence, namely his nature, and what about his nature? His perfection, or his being the greatest possible being. Third, the notion that perfection does not entail significant responsibility. By significant responsibility, I mean responsibility regarding the choice between good and evil. Now, this seems to be intuitively powerful, right? It's hard to imagine a maximally great being who can't choose between good and evil. There seems to be some flaw about him. Making matters worse, if you think that the value in creating human beings was in part because they have significant responsibility, not merely responsibility in choosing between one good act or another, but significant responsibility in choosing between good and evil. It's an odd notion that would be a good feature for human beings, but not for God, right? Why would that be great making or a basic intrinsic value maker for human beings, but not for God? What would explain that? Now, Professor Swinburne says, I would start with omniscience. But why start with omniscience rather than
omnipotence?
Why start with omniscience rather than omnipotence or omnibenevolence? Right? It seems to be an arbitrary starting point. Which of the 3 O's we start out with. Especially if you only have one O, it's particularly important that we don't have an arbitrary starting point in terms of which O we start out with. What about the notion of simplicity? The notion of simplicity, Professor Swinburne says, he says, look, atheism doesn't explain anything, naturalism does. Fine, fair enough. Good point. So the question is, which provides more explanatory power and which is simpler? Let me address simplicity first. If atheism, atheist naturalism, posits fewer types of things, fewer number of things, and a lower complexity per thing, then it's a little hard to see in what way it's not the simpler theory. It posits fewer types of things because theism has to posit everything that the atheism puts forth plus additional things. Same for the number of things. And with regard to the complexity per thing, again, if you have a being with so much computational power, they can track every particle at every time under every possible scenario. It's enormous amounts of informational handling power. It's hard to see why this isn't a complexity maker. Same thing, if you have an individual who is omnipotent and omniscient, the underlying machinery to allow for that much power seems to be incredibly complex. It's not clear why that doesn't add to the complexity of the theory. And also, if you introduce infinities, if you think that there are actual infinities, you might think that there's a number of seeming contradictions we have to escape. The amount of complexity to explain how we escape these things and how infinities work is going to involve considerable complexity. Now, perhaps a theist could say, okay, well, atheism is simpler than theism, but theism explains more. But I don't see what it explains. If the cosmological argument fails, then it doesn't explain why the universe exists or where the universe came from. If fine-tuning fails, it doesn't explain why the universe is finely tuned for human life. And if the modal ontological argument fails, it doesn't explain why we might think that maximal greatness entails necessary existence. So what's left to explain for theism? Perhaps theism can explain things like religious experience, but again, we should be leery of religious experience. One, because it doesn't seem to be replicable, and two, because the object of it seems to be defeated for other reasons. So in short, I don't see that the theist can escape the modal ontological argument. Second, I don't see how the cosmological argument proponent can escape the principle of sufficient reason, not without introducing brute facts all over the place. And third, I don't see why perfection doesn't include significant responsibility. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Steve, for a very dynamic and engaging rebuttal. So now we are going to enter into the open discussion portion of the debate. So there will be a portion allotted on the clock for each speaker to just freely engage with one another. In the meantime, if you have any questions during the course of the debate, feel free to lodge them in the chat. I'm going to gradually be making a queue of questions after Perry and Joe have their time. I just want to see how many questions there may be. So yeah, with that, open discussion will begin. This is unmoderated. So yeah, why don't you guys go ahead?
Oh, so many places to go. I guess I'll start with a question for Steve. So part of what's going on here is like talking about the cosmological argument. I think we need to be a little bit careful with that because there are, of course, lots of different cosmological arguments. And I don't really see much of an issue in a theist like Josh Rasmussen, who doesn't think that God explains himself or doesn't think that there's any sort of self-explanation. He, I think, rightly thinks that that's incoherent. The being would have to already exist in order to have any ability to explain anything, just like it would already have to exist to have any ability to cause anything. But Josh, nevertheless, champions a lot of different cosmological arguments, like contingency arguments and various other sorts of things. And the various explanatory principles that he appeals to aren't, universalized principles of sufficient reason that say that literally every single fact has to have an explanation. It's more so restricted to things like, every contingent thing has to have an explanation, or every limited thing has to have an explanation. So you can run the cosmological argument, I think, without committing to any sort of self-explanation. And likewise, when you talked about the fine-tuning argument, you brought up this conditional claim that if no one designed God, well then God must have a non-design explanation for his existence. But I think someone like Josh, who thinks that self-explanation is incoherent, And me, if I were a theist, I'd say, no, that conditional isn't true. It doesn't follow that there would have to be a non-design explanation for its existence. Maybe God is uniquely unexplained. And maybe we can actually offer a principled explanation for why he is the only thing that could be uniquely unexplained, maybe in terms of perfection or something like that. It's very different to explaining his existence in terms of his own features or something like that. It's rather giving a principled account of why God is uniquely the only thing that couldn't have any explanation whatsoever. And this, I think, also goes to answer your question, like, well, if there's one brute fact, then why not so many different other ones? If we have one of these principles and we think that there's like a relevant difference between limited things and contingent things on the one hand, and like an unlimited thing or a necessary thing on the other with respect to demanding an explanation, well, then you can give a kind of account as to why there would only be one sort of brute fact here. And moreover, we should just develop our theories of reality. And if you can get by with positing only one brute fact, as opposed to, just letting them spill out, well, then that's going to be the best theory, and we should side with that. So just general theory comparison gives us reason to accept that there's only one brute fact as opposed to letting that spill out. Okay, I know that's a long question. Apologies about it, but I hope it's helpful in spurring dialogue.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate the question. So the question is then, why, first of all, why assume that the best version of the cosmological argument relies on the principle of sufficient reason? And second, why think that someone can't say that only a limited class of individuals have explanations, maybe perhaps contingent things or limited things? Okay, so let's take this. Why do I think the principle of sufficient reason is the best version? Because I think that's what we really care about. What we want to know is, what's the reason or cause for things? If someone's saying, look, I'm only interested in contingency and this necessity, well, why? In virtue of what? The reason we care about those things is we want explanations of those things, right? It's not independent of, explanations really are what driving why we care about, whether everything can be contingent or whether everything could be dependent. Now, the second question is, why can't we say things like certain things don't need explanations, maybe unlimited things, or maybe necessary things? Well, that itself seems to need an explanation. I mean, why is it unlimited things don't need an explanation? What's so special about them that limited things need an explanation, but not unlimited things? Same thing. What's so special about contingent things that contingent things need an explanation, but necessary things do not? And I think you suggested the answer. You said, well, maybe God's unexplained because of his perfection. Well, my claim is that you're just backdooring in the ontological argument at this point in time, right? I mean, so instead of saying God's explained, you're saying that God's unexplained, but here's why, in virtue of his perfection. Well, this just looks like a variant of the modal ontological argument, that in virtue of his perfection, he doesn't need an explanation. It's a little hard for me to see how that's different from saying that he's explained in virtue of his perfection. Now, you might wonder, in addition on your point, why think God himself is not contingent? That is, you might think, okay, if only contingent things need explanations, then why isn't God contingent? You might say, well, I don't have a reason for that, in which case we seem to have a huge gap, or I do have a reason, in which case you can say God's necessary. Well, why is he necessary? Some sort of explanation has to come into play. So I think your suggestions are excellent one. I think they're quite powerful, but in the end, I don't think they succeed. In terms of why stop the proliferation of brute facts, I don't see it. I mean, you are right. It's better to have, one brute fact than 10. But if there's no reason to favor 1 over 10, other than the fact that 1 is a lower number than 10, I don't see why that's a reason to cut off the brute facts. And then last, if God's a brute fact, which is what Professor Swinburne says in one of his books, I don't see why we can't simply say the universe is a brute fact. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Perry, dude, you have a question?
Yeah. Before picking on Steve, I'd like to ask Richard a question. Thanks for having me come do this. I imagine you only asked me so that you could have 2 Purdue folks doing that.
Right.
But I'll take what I can get. So Richard, you were talking about how like the uniformity of atoms and the way they act is evidence for theism. You have and I was wondering, what if we think that so we have all these little bits of matter acting in the same way throughout the universe. Maybe we think that is supported by induction. So you find one black crow, which supports there being another black crow, which supports there being another black crow. So we kind of have an explanation there. So maybe the uniformity of the way that these things act isn't what cries out for explanation. maybe it's like diversity that requires an explanation, and maybe we can call this like the DEI objection. So I'm wondering what you think about that kind of objection that to that argument.
Induction doesn't explain anything. It's a reasoning process. It allows you to infer from the characteristics of a small population to the characteristics of a large population. But the question is about the causal explanation of the things to which induction leads. And therefore, these are not in competition.
Okay. Yeah, let me
Yeah.
think about that more. Can I ask one separate short question as well?
Yeah.
You talk about like humans are good, we're mini creators, these are kinds of good things, and that gives us reason to think that God's going to create them. I'm wondering what you think of kind of a skeptical theist response to this, which would be something like, well, it's true that humans are good, being mini creators is a good kind of thing, but you know, we don't really know whether it's good on the whole. It's hard to tell just from our position whether like it'll end up being, say, a net gain having these mini creators in versus other options that God has open to him. So I'm wondering what you think of this skeptical theist kind of skepticism about our ability to predict that God is going to create humans just because they're good, because there could be other things and evils that come with them and other goods that are incompatible with having these kinds of mini creators.
Yeah, well, the answer is God takes risks with us. He's prepared to allow us to have this freedom in the hope that we will use it in the right way. It is not logically possible for any being to foreknow infallibly what another being will do freely in libertarian free terms. So that is the straight answer. I always like on this issue, I always quote from scripture, Genesis 6:6, which refers to the time when just before the flood, and the reason why God produced the flood. And Genesis 6:6 said, God regretted that he had made the world, close quote. And although some many theologians try and put a certain spin on that, it doesn't work. It says what it says. Suppose I can't explain why there's a God. Suppose I don't know the explanation, if there is one. That doesn't make my hypothesis in the least less likely to be true, because every hypothesis of why do chemical substances interact in this way, explain, well, they're made of atoms and the atoms react in this way. Why do atoms react in this way? And then we can go back a bit further. But in the end, you come to a stopping point that may have an explanation, but you don't know it, or simply may not. So it doesn't matter if we don't the correctness of my hypothesis if we haven't got a clue about what explains the existence of God. And I don't have much of a clue either, but I don't think that counts in any way against my hypothesis. Another thing you said, my point may not have quite got home. There are incompatible good states, and libertarian free will is a good state. And being naturally good is also a good state. I would hesitate to, as such, say which is the better good state. Of course, the best of all will be if we have libertarian free will and always use it in the right way. But as regards the starting point, these are just incompatible goods, and no being can be expected to have incompatible good states. Well, that's a couple of answers anyway. Oh, yes, but look, naturalism and brute facts. I don't appeal to God being I did say that that brute facts need to have some particular characteristic in order to be acceptable brute facts. We should explain as much as we can, as much as we can find explanations for. And I think I can find explanations for all the general features of the universe. But of course, I have to do it by postulating something for which I can't find an explanation. But that doesn't count against this. But naturalism is committed to the view that the powers and liabilities of each individual atom don't have a further explanation. So it's committed to there being an infinite number of brute facts. And an explanation is better if it postulates fewer good facts. And the one I've suggested, I postulates only one. And then, Steve, you made the suggestion that this would need an awful lot of computational power. Well, it would if God was relying on computers to do his work for him. But the hypothesis of theism is that God has this property, his one property of being able to do all these things. And if you think, oh, well, it's not possible that somebody could have that without having a computer to help them, that doesn't take seriously the point that science postulates that its starting points of some scientific theory always can postulate any supposition, so long as it's simple and leads to the consequences. And sometimes science seems to postulate that individual things have extraordinary powers. For example, it postulates that every atom in the universe attracts every other atom. Now, it's an enormous number of enormously big power for atoms to have, but yes, that's the starting point of the theory of gravity. And the starting point of theism is an omnipotent being. And you said why an omnipotent being rather than an omniscient or any other? Well, we have to go for the one that can explain the others. And I've given you an explanation of how omnipotence leads to omniscience and perfect goodness. Now, I don't think omniscience has any consequences for omnipotence at all. There could be an omniscient machine which couldn't make a difference to the world. And there can certainly be perfectly good beings which don't know anything and that can't do anything. So we postulate what is able, if it exists, to explain the other things. Sorry, I've talked too much once again. Somebody else's turn.
All right, no worries. So I think that Joe has two quick questions. So Joe, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I got one quick question for Steve and then one hopefully, I mean, I hope it's quick for both you guys. But so one thing in Steve's case was that theism has little explanatory power in the absence of, the success of, the cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument, the modal ontological argument. I just that didn't strike me as particularly plausible or convincing a suggestion, because if you look in the the annals of philosophy of religion, you got all these different sorts of arguments, like from psychophysical harmony that theism can arguably explain, moral knowledge, miracle reports, beauty, large-scale order and intelligibility of the universe, and so on down the line. So I don't know, it didn't seem terribly plausible to me, and I'm wondering what you think, Steve, that in the absence of the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, theism doesn't have significant explanatory power. I mean, these are pretty significant features of reality that theism still seems like it'd be able to explain even in the absence of those things.
Sure, excellent point, and thank you. So it was shorthand for the fact I think those are the most plausible claims, that if theist explains anything, then this is what it explains. Take the moral, that there is morality or that there's moral knowledge. I take it, if you think that the Euthyphro objection succeeds, and I think it does, this shows that morality is independent of God. So if you think that somehow that God's existence explains why we have morality or why we know it, I don't think there's a very powerful argument. So precisely because it would seem standard argument, it'd be arbitrary why we have the morality we do rather than some other one. So I do not think that argument succeeds. What about things like miracles? Yeah, I mean, I do think theism would explain miracles. I just don't think the evidence for miracles is very strong. I mean, usually there's not replicability. We don't. There's plenty of reason to think that these were not under very careful laboratory type conditions, and so it's not that it has no explanation. It just doesn't have a lot of explanation, and not a lot of explanation that would provide strong support for theism. I do think theism provides some explanation for religious experience, but again, I just don't think that's very strong evidence for God's existence, but that is some evidence. So I guess what I would say is I'm using shorthand for the fact that there's a long list of arguments other than the big three that I've mentioned. I think most of those are strongly implausible, with the exception of religious experience. And again, I just think it's not a strong case for miracles. The one you see in people like William Lane Craig, when they say that theism explains morality, it just does not seem to be a good argument, right? I mean, no matter how you structure it, even if you think that God's very nature doesn't allow him to create morality differently, you would ask, why is God's nature limited in this way? It would only be limited in this way if morality was in fact objective and independent of God. So I think your point's an excellent one, but I just think, look, if these arguments can provide strong inductive evidence, probably going to be those three big arguments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And then if I could just ask one quick question to Richard. Richard, one of your arguments, or I guess your kind of main argument in your opening statement, seems to me to be contrasting theism with something like a kind of naturalistic atheism, where kind of fundamental reality is kind of indifferent to value and isn't really oriented towards producing things of value or goodness. But I was wondering what you think about non-theistic hypotheses, which nevertheless could be value-oriented hypotheses. So which posit either some foundational reality or maybe something which is directed towards the production of good things, but which is nevertheless not God. So I'm thinking of things like, Tom Nagel has teleological laws. There are various versions of like cosmopsychism and other things that like Philip Goff has recently developed. And just lots of other sorts of like value-oriented views, which would seem to explain why we get like a large-scale universe with simple laws, morally free, valuable creatures like us, etc. So I'm wondering if that kind of impacts your argument, Richard.
I hope not. But the basic objection I would make is if you postulate something other than God, which is responsible for all these features in virtue of the goodness of those things, the question arises as to why that something should just produce good things. Why doesn't it produce evil things? And the answer will have to be, well, it's made to produce good things. And then you see that adds a complexity. Whereas given my argument from the omnipotence of God and to the to goodness being something which, if you recognize you have an inclination to do, derives the goodness from the other feature of God, the basic feature of God, which has to be described by your rival theory. And your rival theory has not got merely to say that it's good producing, which is strange. I mean, why on earth should it be? This is an extra feature for a non-conscious being. Conscious beings are aware of goodness as attractive. A non-conscious being won't be aware of goodness as attractive. It may have an encyclopedia which tells it which things are good and which aren't, but it doesn't have an ability to recognize them, because the ability to recognize them is the ability to be attracted by them. And that is what only a conscious being can do. So, and I would think also these other theories have to spell out or more than merely just say maybe there is something. And when they start spelling it out, it becomes very much more complicated than my hypothesis. For example, I mean, laws, the only laws we know anything about are laws. I mean, if you hypostasize laws, and I gave reason for not doing so, but if you do hypostasize laws, then the only laws we know anything about are laws which say this initial condition is followed by that initial condition. They're not laws saying so and so comes into existence. They're not. That's not what a law is. So it would have to be a very special sort of law. In other ways, the description would have to be boosted up and complexified compared with what I'm suggesting.
So we have plenty of questions, and I would love to ask some questions, given that Mulligan is my advisor and it seemed relevant, but I will refrain. Okay. I made a queue for the questions, so let me just refer back up to that for a moment before we jump into it. So I believe that the first question is going to go to Matthew. So Matthew, if you'd like to ask your question. So we're going to do one question, and then if you would like to ask a second question, go back, because we just have so many questions. I want to get them all in. So
okay.
Matthew, go ahead.
So my question is for Steve. So you suggest that simplicity has to do with the number and the types of things that you invoke. Now, Richard, he disagreed. He thinks that it's not the number and types of things that you invoke, but rather the fundamental things that you invoke, from which you explain the other things. And so it seems like, on the view according to which what matters is just the number of and types of things, this would have very strange implications for simplicity. It might imply, for instance, that solipsism wins out, for solipsism posits that just your mind exists, not the other stuff, even if it's very complicated, even if the thing that it posits as fundamental is very complicated. And it seems to imply that, suppose we're deciding what God did, we should have a preference for God having done fewer things on the grounds of parsimony, because if he did more things, if he created more things, then there would be a greater number of types of things. It seems odd to think that the choices of an agent are in some way parsimony in that way, that God is sort of like more likely to do fewer things simply because that would be simpler. So I'd be curious what you make.
Great. So Matthew, great to see you, and I like the question. So I think two things determine which theory is more likely to be true. Number one is simplicity, but two is explanatory power. So if it's a case that atheistic naturalism has more explanatory power and is simpler, then I think it's more likely. Now, you said, you brought up Professor Swinburne's point that, look, simplicity has to do with the number of fundamental relations and not the number of things, the types of things, or the complexity per thing. I guess I just disagree. I mean, I think complexity includes all those things, and the number of fundamental explainers is just one of these, right? A number of fundamental explainers might be a number of things, might be one of the number of things, might be a number of types of things, or complexity per thing. It might have great weight, but I don't think it's a new category. In any case, because I don't think the theist has provided a fundamental explainer, right? Simply invoking God as a brute fact seems no different than invoking the universe as a brute fact. I don't see that he's provided an advantage in terms of the fundamental explainers. In essence, the theist has just punted on the issue, saying, I don't have a fundamental explainer. In terms of solipsism and how many actions God performed, wouldn't that be supported by simplicity? I think the answer is yes, but it's not the only criterion. The other criterion is explanatory power, and I think once you invoke that, then those theories become less plausible.
Okay. Perfect. So next in the queue, and by the way, Matthew, yeah, so if you want to ask a follow-up, then we can kind of circle back and close the loop in corporate speak. But perfect. So next in the list is Eric. So Eric, if you want to ask your question, go ahead.
Thank you. So I've got a question for Richard. I'm not sure that this is like a data objection or anything, but it strikes me that you're overemphasizing the complexity of naturalistic views of the world. So just to take an example, Lower and Albert's kind of statistical mechanical imperialism, where they want to explain everything in terms of the initial conditions of the universe. And so they've got this past hypothesis, the hypothesis that the initial state of the universe was very low entropy. They've got the microcanonical ensemble, so some claims about the initial distribution of probabilities across the initial conditions compatible with the past hypothesis. And then either if you're going classical Newtonian laws, or the quantum laws tell you how these states evolve over time. So it seems that actually there's relatively few postulates here. Yes, they propose the existence of lots of particles, but they've got a very simple way of specifying the initial state. There's also the fact that the like ideological resources that they use here are the absolute bare minimum. I mean, they help themselves to just like the stuff that we're committed to from our best scientific theories, and possible worlds talk. They don't have anything other than that. So it looks like ideologically it's way simpler than theism. So it at least looks plausible to me that this kind of naturalism is going to win out. Obviously, depending on how plausible you think the kind of statistical mechanical approach is. But I just use it as an example. It seems to me that a lot of the complexity can be cut down here for the naturalist.
Yes, that's an interesting suggestion. But in my view, you have to build in such a lot into the Big Bang to get our universe. The Big Bang has to have built into it a propensity to produce particles which behave, as we would say, subject to strong forces, weak forces, and so on. And the very description of what you have to build in is extremely complicated, in my view. Now, of course, I don't know the details of this theory, and I may be mistaken there. But all I can say is intuitively, it seems extraordinarily implausible that you could build in to the Big Bang anything like sufficient to produce our universe. And what is particular about our universe, coming back to an earlier point, is its overall goodness. And for an inanimate thing to produce only things that have value and so on, requires itself a complexity that is not there if you postulate God as the starting point. But I think you would need to postulate a great deal more, and I'd be interested if you could demonstrate that will not merely lead to the existence of galaxies, etc., but the sort of universe which one of whose constituents is the small planet that we live in, which has such a propensity to produce human beings. It would have to include in it, as it were, consciousness producing features as well as physical features. And I bet you that theory doesn't include conscious producing features. So there is one obvious deficiency, or rather one obvious way in which it's not a simple theory.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. So now we are going to turn to Carlo's question. I think that he's having audio issues, so he asked me to read it, which is perfectly fine. So the question is for Steve. So it reads as follows. As you know, Steve, I'm a deist, so I tend to agree with you on the argument you put forth. However, you want to say that your arguments are arguments for atheism. However, as far as I can see, yours are arguments against theism, God with a capital G. So even if your arguments are sound, they do not support atheism. So yeah, that's a question to you, Steve.
Excellent. So a great question, and thank you, Carlo. I'm not seeing why would we think they're sort of small g gods. or why we would think that there'd be a God who disappeared, sort of big G God who disappeared. I'm not seeing the argument. Again, we could replay exactly the same claims with regard to the deist living and dying on the modal ontological argument. And the deist might say, well, look, I'm just not presupposing a greatest possible being. Okay, but then what is the explanatory work that's done by the moderately great being? What is being explained by it? Does the individual explain the existence of the universe? Why? It doesn't seem that why does this person exist? We seem to go right back to the principle of sufficient reason. Does the person fine-tune the universe? Well, again, we need an explanation of why you have an undesigned designer. So I'm not sure what explanatory power, what explanatory performance we're getting out of the deist theory that we're not getting out of the theist theory. That is, if the theist theory does not do significant explanatory work, and I claim that it doesn't, I don't see the argument for thinking that the deist theory does any better.
All right, so perfect. Next question. The next question comes from Richard. So Richard, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead and do so.
Yeah, hello. Just real quick. I have many questions, but I'm only going to ask one. Today is, so I'm put it this way. And this is for Richard, the other Richard here. For God to have infinite power for no reason entails an extraordinarily lucky coincidence, because God then has infinite specified complexity, whereas far weaker creators would be more likely if we were selecting creators at random. So why are we to assign God any significant prior probability? Isn't it even luckier to randomly have a God conveniently exist than to just randomly get a habitable universe by itself?
No, because think what a habitable universe is. It consists of an infinite number of bits. And if you suppose that they're the starting points, then you have an infinite number of starting points. I want a good explanation, the best explanation, would have just one starting point. The possibility raised by an earlier question that the Big Bang might itself, as it were, have no dimensions. If that were the case, then it would have to have a lot of complicated powers. Now, I think God is the postulate of essential everlasting omnipotence is a very simple power. Postulate, a property, a very simple property. Why do I think that? Well, my criteria of simplicity, which I think were on the handout, though I didn't run through them in detail, is that hypothesis simple insofar as it postulates the existence of few entities, well, only one, few kinds of entities, only one, few properties. The only property postulated is the property of power to an infinite degree and lasting for an infinite number of time. And infinite in both these cases is simply zero limit to. Distinguish that sort of infinity, which is a degree of a power, from an infinite number of substances, which is a quite different notion and not one that I'm employing. And the kinds of properties which we are postulating, albeit to an infinite degree, must be observable or experienceable. Well, the property of power is certainly experienceable. We got it ourselves in very small degree. The only difference is God has it to an unlimited degree. Mathematically simple degrees and relations between, well, there are no relations between properties in my hypothesis, and the degree is a simple degree because naught is a simple number by my criteria. One number is simpler than another. If we can understand the first without understanding the second, and we can understand the concept, the number naught, without understanding the number 3 or 4 or 5. we'd have to understand the number 1, of course, but we are naught is a very simple number, even if perhaps there is one simpler one. And therefore, this is satisfied very well. Any alternative hypothesis is going to involve mathematical numbers of a kind that would be very unsimple by these criteria.
Perfect, Steve. I think you had to follow up.
Yeah, I just want to quickly touch on the simplicity of God. I claim that the 3 O's and perfect freedom are incompatible with one another. It can be at most one of those, that each one conflicts with the other. As an example, for example, omnipotence and omnibenevolence seem to conflict because an omnipotent being can do evil and an essentially omnibenevolent being cannot. So the question is, could someone say, well, God's simple in virtue of we just start out with one of these features. We just start out with omniscience, or we just start at omnipotence. A couple things to say here. Number one, it's arbitrary, right? We need an explanation as to why you start out with 1 O rather than one of the other O's or with perfect freedom. Second, it seems to be false that from one we can derive the others. Take the notion that from omniscience we can derive omnipotence. It's just not the case. I mean, if you were essentially omnipotent, then you can't have a day say understanding of what it's like to be weak or vulnerable. If you can't have such an understanding, then you cannot be essentially omnipotent. It's also to be irrelevant. Even if you could derive the other O's from one of the O's, it doesn't mean that that's a very good theory, right? Why should we do this derivation? And then fourth, in terms of complexity, if someone says, look, God is essentially omniscient or God is essentially omnipotent, and this is simple, I just don't see it as being simple. There's got to be some sort of explanation in virtue of what is God essentially omniscient. That is, he can grasp every particle in the universe under every possible scenario. For someone to say, well, he just can, I don't see that as being simple because there has to be something to explain it. Even if it's not mechanical machinery or computational silicon chips, still there's got to be some explanation, and it's hard to see how that explanation could be simple.
Well, the answer to that is I thought I'd gone through that before. Omnipotence, I think, is the crucial one. By the reasoning that I gave earlier, an omnipotent being will be able to do anything logically possible. That's always been the understanding of omnipotence. Aquinas makes this point. Omnipotent beings aren't required to do something logically impossible. And what omniscience amounts to, and what is also omniscience follows from that, in that God must know what the choices before him are, otherwise he wouldn't be truly omnipotent. If he's to know what the choices before him are, he must know every consequence of everything he might do. And there's a simple, though may sound rather trivial argument, that in order to know, if you really know everything about the future, you have to know everything about the past as well. For example, if God is to know that he can bring about the occurrence of a third world war, he has to know that, or rather, put it this way, if God is to know that he can't produce a second world war, he has to know that there have already been 2 world wars. And so generally, there are always features of the future which require God to have knowledge of the past in order to know whether he can bring them about. Therefore, he has to know all about the past in order to know and all about the future. But of course, he is not required to know about the future if he has not already decided to know about the future. That's because the future is not fixed and there is nothing to know. But with that limitation, omniscience follows from omnipotence. And since omniscience, like omnipotence, is only the knowledge of what's logically possible to know, it's not logically possible for an omnipotent being to know what he is going to do at a time if he has not already decided what to do. That is logically impossible to know. And likewise, I have purported to derive perfect goodness from the others. And I pointed out that you can't do it the other way. Omniscience doesn't entail omnipotence. There could be a totally omniscient being who couldn't do anything. And there could be a perfectly good being, maybe there are plenty, who can't make any difference to the world. So obviously, omnipotence is where we start from. And I'm not arguing God is a perfect being, therefore he must have such and such characteristics. I am arguing God does have such and such characteristics. And as a matter of fact, I can't conceive of a more perfect being, but I don't rely on that. I rely on the claim that there is a God in the sense that I have defined.
Perfect. And then so for the last question, we're going to go to Eric Wielenberg. I believe that he has a question. So Eric, if you want to go ahead, feel free to do so.
Okay, thanks. So my question is for Steve. And Steve, you may have touched on this, but I sort of want to ask you to just focus on a particular part of Professor Swinburne's argument. Also, I saw that Paul wrote something in the chat that maybe is an answer to the question. But in any case, so my question is, if I understand Professor Swinburne's argument correctly, there's a sort of key part, maybe two things together. One is, I think, a view of what it really is for like a law of nature to apply to like all the atoms in the universe or all the bits of iron. And as I understand it, I think the idea is that what that really amounts to is simply all of the atoms, for example, strewn across the universe have the exact same powers and liabilities. And then the idea is on atheistic naturalism, it seems to be an amazing coincidence that all the atoms throughout all the universe have exactly the same powers and liabilities, and that constitutes some kind of weakness in comparison with theism. And so again, I guess my question is on what do you have to say specifically on that aspect of the argument? And again, you may have touched on it, but I'm hoping you can sort of focus in.
Great. So thanks, Eric. Fantastic question, as always. Appreciate it. So the question is, isn't it unlikely that we'd have uniformity? Or alternatively, isn't uniformity just descriptive rather than explanatory? Is that a fair account of the question? Why do we have this uniformity in particle or object behavior? And also, is it just a merely description of it, or does it explain? Is there an explanation of it? Is that a fair account of your question?
Yeah, I think the key is what explains that. Especially, I mean, there may be an inclination to say, well, like it's a law of nature, or just there's a law that applies to all the atoms. But I think a key part of Professor Swinburne's argument is like all that really means or amounts to is just all these different things across the universe having the same tendencies and so on. And so it's that, I think, as he puts it, like there's zillions or maybe infinitely many on naturalism, like brute facts, like this atom and this atom and this atom and this atom having the exact same powers and liabilities. I think his idea is theism can explain that, whereas a naturalist has to just say like that's just how it is, and then there's an explosion of like all these unexplained coincidences, basically.
Excellent. So, I mean, I do think there is an explanation. The explanation is going to be a more fundamental nature of how it is objects of time and space function. So, you explain in terms of quantum physics or relativistic physics or something along those lines. But you might say, well, what explains that? Don't we have to go one step down? Or what explains the uniformity? So one, I'm not sure what the probabilities of the lack or presence of uniformity is. I mean, do we have a way of assessing whether or not uniformity is more likely or less likely than diversity in terms of patterns of fundamental ways in which particles act. I don't know what the baseline is, but I would say even if there is a problem, even if we're really describing it rather than explaining it, we're saying, look, this is just how these things behave. I'm not sure that theism is in a better position, right? Again, if you say, well, God explains it, we're going to have another Euthyphro problem. In virtue of what? Did God choose this arrangement rather than some other one? Now, someone might say, well, it's the good of human pleasure of flourishing. But, I mean, one problem with that is why think that God is limited in this way? Why think that you could only get intelligent life if you got biological life? Or you can only have intelligent life if you have uniformity in physical laws? So I guess I would say is I think we have an explanation that gets increasingly deeper as we have a better and better understanding of the fundamental ways that particles interact with one another. But second, I would say that I don't see how the theist in any better position than the atheist. That is, to the extent the atheist says, look, all I can do is describe it, and I don't have a way of assessing the probability, I just don't see the theist as being in a better position in virtue of the fact the theist has to explain why God would do this. And in the absence of an explanation, it doesn't seem that the theist has gotten us any further.
Perfect. So with that last question, we'll go to the closing statements. This has been an electric and interesting and dynamic question period. Thank you for all the questions that have been asked. I very much appreciate it. I'm sure our debaters do as well. All right, Richard, with that, would you like to begin your closing statement? 2 minutes, yeah.
Well, I'll begin with an apology for keeping you all waiting half an hour. After that, I don't see anyone has produced any detailed objection to what I have proposed. But I will take the advantage of the 2 minutes to answer the last point made by Steve. And that is to say, I am not claiming that the mere existence of God can explain the details of every natural law. But I am claiming that the existence and action of God can explain why it is the case that all particles behave in the same way. I don't think it can explain why the same way is the particular way it is, but it would have to be the way in which it's compatible with the existence of human beings who have libertarian free will and who are conscious. And it may be there is only one way of producing that, or maybe there's a half a dozen. And if there are half a dozen equally good ways of producing this effect, then God will have to do what we all have to do when there are two equally good ways of reaching a result. That is to say, make a mental toss-up and go for one of them rather than the other. But what I am saying is that the ways must be such as to have the effect of producing us in a world where we are able to produce different effects for good or ill on the world, on each other, and ourselves. And that requires things to behave in the world in a predictable way so that we know the effect of our actions will be this, or alternatively, if we do an action in different circumstances, it will be that. And that requires regularities in the behavior of things, and that's only going to be happening if there are underlying particles behave in exactly the same way in different places. So God can explain the, as it were, parameters within which human beings can exist and flourish. But of course, I think somebody suggested it doesn't predict that there will be evolution, that we will arrive as a result of evolutionary process. It just predicts there will be us, and there are various ways in which us could come into existence other than by evolution and natural selection. But it explains the basic fact of us with the powers that we have. The universe has to be of a certain kind, and God can explain why it's of that kind. The details, if it doesn't make any difference, God can make an arbitrary choice.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard, for your closing statement. It's very concise and interesting and persuasive. Steve, why don't you go ahead and provide your closing statement?
So, just a brief recap, and then I'll address Richard's issue. Again, I think I've argued that the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments depend on the modal ontological argument. Because the modal ontological argument fails or is unsound, those other two arguments fail as well. I've argued that on inductive grounds, atheism is more likely than theism. In terms of Richard's argument that, look, God explains the uniformity of natural laws, I don't see this. I mean, why couldn't human beings gain a greater understanding if they were just localized homogeny? That is, if our particular solar system had a certain set of natural laws, but other solar systems had different laws, why would that limit our understanding or our freedom or ability to serve each other's interests? I should further note that Richard's argument for the value of this understanding is tied in with libertarian free will. Right, the idea that it's good that we're responsible and responsible only for libertarian free will. But I guess I'd like to revisit my argument that if it's good for human beings to have significant responsibility in terms of choosing between good and evil, why wouldn't that also be true regarding God? I should also mention that having your argument depend on libertarian free will is going to be problematic if you think this is a bad theory, and I do. I think it's a bad theory because it doesn't provide a contrastive explanation why someone zigged rather than zagged, why someone did the good thing rather than the evil thing. Rather, it has an indeterministic role, and indeterminism is not a responsibility maker. So I'm not sure that having libertarian free will play such a large part of one's theory is a good idea if, as I claim, libertarianism is false. But in short, I don't see why homogeny is better than diversity in terms of promoting human understanding. It might slow it down a little, but there'd be that much more to understand. Or alternatively, why it is that having diversity would somehow block free will or block serving our interests. We could have localized similarity of laws, but the laws could differ between different solar systems, for example, or different galaxies. I really appreciate your inviting me to participate in this. And again, it's an honor and a pleasure to debate it with Richard Swinburne, who played such a large role in my intellectual development. So thank you to everyone. And thank you, Nathan, for inviting me.
Anytime. Well, perfect. Thank you all for joining and sticking with us through this extensive debate. And Richard, I just want to say it's an absolute honor, probably one of the highlights of my philosophical career, that I get to hear you speak live. Your influence on me has been unparalleled, and I think that you're probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Christian philosophers alive. So thank you just so much for everything that you've contributed to this field, and the world is a better place for your philosophical work, and I think that we could all agree with that. So
you're very kind.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us in the audience. It's been lovely. When Paul sends me the video, I'll edit everything to make sure everything looks nice and neat. But yeah, thank you for joining. It's been wonderful, and I hope to see you soon. If you have any questions, email me. But yeah, all right, see you guys.